Hey, it's Friday, everybody. We're back in our normal setting outside the lab like last week. It's the Friday CUI Hotline Q&A. It's everybody's favorite
Here we are.
everybody's favorite time of the week. We're on LinkedIn. We're streaming on YouTube, so feel free to add your questions in the chat. You can go to cuihotline.org and fill out the form or call the number. We've got questions that we've heard on calls this week. We've got questions that we heard at Navy Gold Coast this week. There's new CIO memos basically every week for this last 2 months. So we got stuff to talk about, everything that's going on. Daniel, what's going on with you?
All sorts of things. I mean, the most interesting thing is this DoD memo that was not publicized at all. I had a tab open with the DoD procurement toolbox open. I was like, I'm just going to go look at the FA or the cybersecurity section and just see if anything's been posted or published about anything at this point. And sure enough, this memo just kind of snuck in. I think it was approved back in, let's see, was it August 7th? I just posted this on my LinkedIn as well. Posted back or for publication on August 7th. I probably didn't make the procurement website for a week or two because we only all just saw it and we're usually pretty in tune with this stuff. The intent of it, at least from what I can read and gather, was to try and communicate to the contracting officers, hey, make sure to self-attest in year one. Don't be requiring all this other stuff, this burdensome requirements for certification. Make sure to align with what 32 CFR says about the phased rollout. Well, that seems fantastic, right? So when you look through this, it's like, okay, they specifically say PMs and requiring activities should include CMMC self-assessments in applicable solicitations and contracts. Making sense so far? Then they add another piece inside of this memo saying, hey, by the way, we actually provided clearer guidance earlier this year. Here's the link for it on what should require, what type of CUI is going to require certification and self-attestation. Okay. Well, when you go back to that memo that the new memo references, you probably can't read the text at the bottom here, but it basically says for any defense-related CUI under that organizational index, require certification. Well, Daniel, so are we self-attesting, year one for everything? Or are we going to have certification requirements? Well, because the new memo points to the old memo in January saying, follow this guidance, I'm going to tell you certification if you're dealing with defense level CUI, which, by the way, my estimate, in manufacturing, some parts of the AEC industry, regulated research, we're looking, I would have to assume about 60 to 70% of the data in receipt or in generation on behalf of a defense contract is probably under the defense CUI category, if I'm a betting man.
Almost, this is the thing, right? Is that people point to the NARA CUI registry as if the average defense contractor is handling tax information, or that the average defense contractor is handling protected witness information from the Department of Justice, right? It isn't true that all these categories of CUI are relevant to defense contractors. And when you narrow it down, you're like, most defense contractors handle these types of data that they're saying will require level 2 certification.
Yep. And that's the tricky part here is one of the kind of ultimate types of CUI under the Defense Organizational Index is controlled technical information, or CTI. So I'm going to read off just a blurb off NARA. Technical information with military or space application means any blueprints, drawings, plans, instructions, computer software, documentation that can be used or be adapted for use to design, engineer, produce, manufacture, operate, repair, overhaul, or reproduce any military or space equipment or technology concerning such equipment. Dear Lord, Jacob, that seems to cover a lot, especially a lot of things that the DoD is doing specifically.
Let's look at it from a different perspective, right? Not only does it count as does it cover a lot, but it's also from the perspective of the contractor. If you're a contractor and you're putting super cool stuff on satellites, then the data that you're handling or generating is this data, right?
Yep.
If you're a machine shop and you put precision parts on hypersonic missiles, then you're handling this data, right?
Yep.
So it's from the perspective of the data down, it covers a lot of things, but from your perspective as a defense contractor, most people clearly fall underneath this category. And then the problem becomes this. I'm very confused about this memo. Like I posted about this today as well, where the DoD has verbally stated that in phase 1, they want level 2 to be mostly self-assessment, but that isn't what 32 CFR 170 says in policy. It says that the DoD has discretion when applicable contracts will involve covered data. And then they had the February memo that said, this is the covered data. And the minimum requirement for this data is level 2 certification. And then this newest memo comes out this week and they say, here's some clarifying guidance, refer to 32 CFR 170 and the February memo. And so it's like, okay, if your intent is for most of them to be level 2 self-assessment, whatever, right? Like I don't agree, but that's what you want. But from the outside, that's not what the policy appears to say. And so when companies are trying to strategize around what to do, like what would you want them to do with this information? Not what you say you want to do, but what the policy says you will do. And so as a result of what the guidance currently says, if you assume that you will get a level 2 self-assessment based off of the public information that we have in policy, you're taking a big risk. And maybe it works out and you get a bonus 12 months. Maybe it doesn't, and then you're screwed. It's just, there's nothing in the policy that says there will only be self-assessments in phase 1. And so when you look at the guidance, you're like, I can't in good conscience tell people that you can reliably get a level 2 self-assessment in phase 1 based off the current guidance.
I can't either. I can't understand. The memo didn't provide any clarity. It just reinforced, go do the things we already told you. Well, the industry was hoping something like a memo like this would come out and basically state you should self-attest 100% in year 1. This is, by the way, this memo is the DoD talking to their contracting officers. It is who the intent of the audience is for. And so when you're looking at this, it's like the DoD came out with guidance on what should be certified and what should be self-attested in February, March of this year. Then this memo basically says, hey, but really make sure to self-attest, except like look back at this memo as well back in February, March, and do what it says. And so I kind of added this summary at the end of my LinkedIn post and was basically like, long story short, this DoD memo appears to be a feel good for the industry to make it seem like certifications won't be required year 1. But in the same memo, it points out a completely different plan requiring CMMC certification based on defense CUI. And I have been around people most of my life. And if I know one thing, contracting officers will take the position of CYA with CUI. I just don't see a world where this memo doesn't help the industry anymore from a self-attestation perspective. It just points them back to what's going to require to be certified and not. And most defense contractors are working at a minimum with controlled technical information.
Yeah, somebody's saying the memo does nothing to discourage businesses from taking the low-cost gamble. It just increases the odds that a lot of them are going to lose their bet when a solicitation demands a C3PAO assessment, leaving them with only months to accomplish a year's worth of expensive overhead preparation. That's a good point. It also leaves out the variable of what the primes are going to require, because like I was talking to people at Gold Coast this week, I was like, we're trying to extrapolate individual situations from Pentagon level guidance. And that's very difficult to do because you don't know what individual PMs, individual KOs, or individual primes are going to do across all these separate programs, separate requiring activities, separate components, separate systems, commands, things like that. Some program under Missile Defense Agency might have a very different idea of what they want versus a random legacy program under NAVFAC somewhere, right? And you're probably not the same contractor doing work for both of those things. So your experience in the rollout of CMMC could be vastly different from people in the same town as you down the street, depending on who you're doing the work for. And so we don't know what those individual customers are going to do. And so to me, as a big worrier guy who thinks about risks all the time, I'm like, you're making a risky bet, like they were saying in the comment, where it's like, if you get it wrong, you won't have time to correct. If you get it right, then that's wonderful. the downside being you get the certification and then the solicitation comes out and says you only needed self-assessment. So it's tough because it's like you don't want to have to spend the money if you don't have to, but you also won't have enough time to know if it was the right choice if you wait until the solicitation comes out. So it's tough, right? And I was at Gold Coast this week, and during the Project Spectrum session, one of the questions was, hey, from the audience, right? From the audience, they said, hey, during phase one, it's only self-assessment, right? And Project Spectrum is out there saying, yeah, it's only going to be self-assessment because there's that diagram at the bottom of this memo. It's like the PowerPoint, smart art flowchart thing. And it just says phase one self-assessments except where applicable. And you're like, guys, the PowerPoint diagram's not policy, right? Like,
right. PowerPoint's not policy. God,
and
that's
so
an
it's
awesome
like
little saying there, Jacob.
Yeah, PowerPoint isn't policy. I sure wish it was with how much PowerPoint that I do. But yeah, it's just be aware of the risk that you're taking and try not to extrapolate your individual situation from generic Pentagon guidance, especially if you're doing some high speed, cool stuff. So, a good example of this, yet another CIO memo, although this one is not published. We just did the podcast yesterday on it. So there's this sort of the CIO memo that's been floating around. I got it emailed to me. I got it DM'd to me. It was on Discord. It was everywhere, but it's not posted anywhere. So I guess it's a scoop.
Scoop it. Yeah.
And it's this memo that outlines cybersecurity requirements for Golden Dome contractors. And Golden Dome is this massive program of space-based interceptors for intercontinental ballistic missiles, not just from countries like North Korea, but also the next level up from countries like China and Russia, which is a much harder problem to deal with because you're doing space-based interceptors, counter hypersonics. You're doing some real, in the words of Stacy Boschanek, you're doing some real whiz-bang stuff, right?
Love a whiz-banger.
Yeah, this is the high-speed stuff that they're talking about. And so the thing about it is that this program is so humongous and involves so many existing programs, new programs, that they refer to the Golden Dome suppliers as the Golden Dome for America, the GDA industrial base, right? They're actually like referring to it as a segment itself. So this is missiles, satellites, ground control, all that stuff, shipboard, land-based, space-based. It's a lot of companies. And this memo basically just, the part we were talking about on the podcast is the first thing they talk about is that the core piece of cybersecurity requirements for the Golden Dome industrial base is DFAR 7012, CMMC, 7019, 7020, all the classics, right?
Yep. They
went on to say that CMMC Level 3 will be a part of this situation, which makes total sense. If you have a satellite-based counter hypersonic sensor, then you clearly are not going to be able to self-assess at level 1. It's pretty important stuff. So it's like we're going to go through this phased rollout, and it's just tough to reconcile this idea that everyone is going to get level 2 self-assessments in phase 1 when Golden Dome memos are out there saying that, hey, this level 2 is just the first step in all these other cyber and supply chain requirements that we're going to apply to people. So we haven't posted this memo anywhere because we haven't seen it officially linked anywhere, but we discussed the contents of the memo on the podcast on Thursday. Like, we're not a news agency here, but it's also relevant information for our clients and the ecosystem and potential clients. So we talk about it. But yeah, so it's just wild to watch. You're watching the policy roll out in one direction, and then you go to events like Gold Coast where there are people who put missile components on ships that are part of this Golden Dome program, and everybody's assuming they're going to be able to self-assess. And so you're like, is that true? I don't know. I don't know what to tell you because I don't know what your individual customer is going to say. So just take all of this into account and understand the risk that you're taking is my best advice here.
Ask your contracting officer or your prime, what type of CUI are we working with? And if it's anything in that defense category, you should be very concerned.
Yeah. And I mean, as we know, 12 months, let's just say that like your initial thing, CMMC rolls out, they say self-assessment for 12 months. 12 months ain't a lot of time, everybody, because
No.
tell you what I saw at Gold Coast. I saw this happen and everybody knows that it's true. This isn't going to be a surprise to anybody. In every session where CMMC was discussed, for example, in the Project Spectrum session, somebody asked the question, everybody's getting real nervous about all these requirements. Somebody will say, well, we get to self-assess for the first year, right? And then when they hear yes, a sigh of relief goes out across the room because people are equating self-assessment with I get to continue doing nothing, right? Like
Yes.
I get more time before I have to prove that I have implemented these requirements, right? Self-assessment is a joke. And when people hear they get to self-assess, they take their foot off the gas. And so I just don't know how reliable it will be. The DoD after all this time is going to be like, you know what? What's another 12 months among friends? Everybody just self-assess. Even if they do, you're just going to have that rush again at the end of that 12 months because nobody's like reliably, cruising along and working on the requirements during that initial phase in. So,
well, and let's do some math real quick. I today figure out I have to do CMMC. The backlog to start an engagement with a competent consultant's probably 2 to 3 months. Let's say implementation takes 2 or 3 months to implement your environment, assuming you're not just, paying for a VDI seat somewhere, right? You're actually making your org compliant. I mean, you're looking on the low end 6 to 8 months for full organizational adoption, technical and non-technical controls met, typically. Like that varies based on size, but like a solicitation comes out, Jacob, you've reviewed the GAO reports, like average award time is 30, 32 days, something like that. It's like you take 6 to 8 months and you look at 30 days for an award, you're going to miss multiple different, assuming you have concurrent bids going on, you're going to miss multiple concurrent awards that they cannot give you the contract. And I've said this before, and I talk to a lot of small businesses, set aside requirements and mandates by the DoD do not trump CMMC.
Yeah.
You have to look at CMMC first, and then they will look at set asides. So for small businesses, veteran-owned, minority-owned, woman-owned, to say like you name it, that is not going to save you from CMMC, sadly. So just again, to Jacob's point, like we hate the FUD. We hate the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We don't want to be proliferating that type of information in the ecosystem. We do want to produce evidence based on what the DoD is saying and our interpretation of what this looks like. Yeah. And it's not looking good for the majority.
I want you to be able to come up with the effective strategy based off what the policy actions of the DoD are realistically pointing to. It's only FUD if it's not true, right? And so like, the rule has gone to OIRA. The policy did go into place in December. The DoD CIO memos are real. The Hegseth memo is real. Katie's comments a couple months ago about how it's not a mistake that I got put back in this position under this administration is 100% real. And so it's just like people aren't really talking about it at places like Gold Coast. And so we're just making sure that you're trying to come up with an effective strategy for it, for sure. All righty, let's see here. Okay, so this has been something I've been hearing people talk about. I can't remember if we talked about this last week, but just to reiterate here, a lot of people are saying, well, there's like 300 level 2 certified companies, and that isn't a big deal because there's a bunch of MSPs in that group of certified companies. And so contractors aren't really getting assessed. And so, I don't really know how real it is that CMMC certifications are happening. Back in the day, not that long ago, before the 32 CFR final rule came out, there was this whole question about MSPs might be required to get CMMC level 2. And even if they aren't, the MSPs should go out and get their level 2 certification before the rest of the industry, because all of these contractors are connected nodes to these individual MSPs, and they're hyper dependent on the MSPs to pass their certification. And so if the MSPs get certified front loaded in front of all the contractors, then all of those assessments happen faster and more reliably. So by saying that a bunch of the companies in this first 300 companies are MSPs, that's a good thing, because that means that the other assessments will happen more reliably. If the MSPs are the last ones to get the certification, then you're going from the bottom up, essentially. You're going to each individual company connected to an MSP, and then you're asking the same questions over and over again, rather than going to the MSP and then carrying those answers into their assessments, right? So if anybody's like, oh, they're MSPs, they're not contractors, that's a good thing. That's a good thing that there's a sizable percentage of those 300 some odd assessments so far that are MSPs.
I'm gonna completely guess here, just from what I've seen on the internet. You know, what do you think, Jacob? 40 of those 300 probably?
I think, maybe? I can't remember what it is. I can't remember what the MSPs for critical infrastructure database has. I think there's like 25 or so companies that are MSPs that have a level 2 cert. So I think it's somewhere in that neighborhood. It's not the majority by any means, but it is a meaningful percentage, and that's a good thing, because you want the MSPs that service the DIB contractors to have their cert so that they can make the assessments for those contractors go faster, take less time, take less money, be more efficient. That's what everybody should want. That was the reason why, before the final rule came out, we were hoping that they would keep the requirement for MSPs to get a level 2 cert. And then in the phased rollout, they would say, we're going to assess MSPs before we start to assess contractors. That's not what ended up happening, but it looks like we sort of ended up in that situation anyways, which is a good thing.
It's great. It's just high confidence, high trust, right? It's like, oh, I know you know how to do CMMC, because we talk about it all the time. I had another call this week with an 18-person small business that had an MSP that said, we'll get you through CMMC. And then as they're getting close to the finish line of their cert, bowed out. Another one. I mean, it's happening almost on a weekly or bi-weekly.
I was talking to a C3PAO at Gold Coast, and they had a company fail, not false start, an actual assessment failure, because their MSP, who has a level 2 certification, wasn't doing the things for their client that the MSP had to do for their own cert. And
Get out of here.
Yeah. And so the C3PAO was like, we can't help you. Like, it's too much for us to, work with you, 10-day review, all that stuff. Right. And they ended up failing their assessment, and it was 100% the MSP's fault. And so there's like legal action, and there's all this stuff, and it's not for the C3PAO, but between the client and the MSP. So just be careful who you partner with. It's like getting married, right? This is a big decision, and it's could affect a large portion of your life.
That is wild, man.
Yeah,
I had not heard that. This is that's wild.
It was pretty crazy. Yeah, hopefully we can get them on the podcast coming up. Lesson learned from their first, I think, dozen assessments or so. And they had some false starts. They had a failure, because the MSP dropped the ball, and the MSP was certified. So pretty spicy, everybody. Anyway, we're coming up on almost 50 certified clients. So
I know.
You don't have to worry about that with us. Like and subscribe. You know what I'm saying? Let's see. Okay, there's a 2-parter question coming through. I'll wait for Blargflupel to put in part 2, and then we'll go through their question.
What a name!
That's an awesome name. Okay. Oh yeah. So we asked this question last week. What does the assessment period look like for users if they're all set up? I don't know if you just want to review that very quickly. So they sign up with us, they get through the waiting period, they get kicked off, they get implemented, but they're still waiting on their actual assessment. That's not a problem, is it?
It kind of depends on the size of the C3PO. So depending on, their capacity on a business by business basis, you're looking anywhere from, like, I've heard a month backlog to get an assessment, all the way to like 6 or 7 months. So that's definitely a leading question you should ask when it comes to, hey, how fast can you get to me, and part of your decision. Now, the faster they can get to you, probably the more expensive. Also be aware of that, right? Supply and demand. The price of a CMMC assessment is not regulated by the Cyber AB. It is free market, supply and demand, the good old stuff. So, you're probably looking at between I would say 1 to 3 months, probably on average, from, hey, we need to get assessed, to getting through and kicking off and doing phase 1 and then going from there. An average assessment, even for an enclave, you're probably looking sub 3 days of actual assessment time. I know one that went as low as like 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours. It was pretty fast because the boundary was just so tight. But yeah, that's probably what you're looking at.
Yeah. Listen, I got to point out the irony and the contradiction of people who are like, "Oh, boo, CMMC regulation, boo," and then they turn around and they go, "We need price controls." And you're like,
Yeah.
I thought regulation was the problem, everybody. Anyways, let's talk to Blarg Flupel here.
All right, Blarg Flupel.
Blarg Flupel says, I have a two-part question. One, have you seen companies use Perview sensitivity labels in the wild? Do they just use the labeling components or also the access control options?
Great question.
Part two, in the same vein, is there an explicit requirement from 800.171 that requires CUI containing files themselves to be encrypted if I'm sending an email with a CUI containing document externally? I am assuming our environment uses encryption at rest and in transit. All right, let's start with part one. Have you seen companies using Perview sensitivity labels in the wild?
Absolutely. So both on the marking side and on the protection side, and just general access controls. So you can use it for basic CUI. We're also seeing this used at like a site container level for non-US persons that will be in your GCC high environment. So you have basic CUI with no export control, no foreign requirements. And then you have a segment that has export control and no foreign requirements. Using Perview and ACLs, like just general intra-ID dynamic security groups, tends to be what people are leaning towards. But Perview, although we're a Microsoft shop, Perview doesn't solve all the problems, right? Because there are file types that it just can't label. So the other thing to use, and I was in conversations with Ryan Bonner about this a couple of years ago, honestly now, he was like, make templates of all of your types of files with appropriate CUI banner markings and fields and metadata for the non-Perview supported type. So think engineering files is a good example of that, right? And so have somebody create those and put them in the project site and let those templates be the ones that your team are using.
Let's see here for part two. Is there an explicit requirement from 171 that requires CUI files themselves to be encrypted? For instance, if I'm sending an email with a document that has CUI externally.
Yes. So there's two ways for the protection of the confidentiality of CUI. There's physical compensating controls, locks on doors, put it in a safe, put it in a secured facility, all that good stuff. And the other half of that is encryption. So FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography. We have also talked to assessors that are also approving FIPS 140-3 validated cryptography, simply because -2 is getting sunset. So, I mean, it's just hard to get appliances with that validated cryptography on it. So you have to use one of those two means when distributing CUI. So yes, you should have the CUI encrypted when you're sending it external to your organization, because you don't know the system that it's going to land in, right? And so the other thing is you need to make sure that you're sending it to authorized people. So get with your supply chain, validate that the recipients of the organization you're sending have accepted the DFAR 7012 flow down, that have some sort of CCRA maybe filled out, which is a supply chain risk format form that you can get. So yeah, that's it.
There you go. Great questions, Blarg Flupel. So this was a question that came up at one of the Gold Coast sessions. One of the guys who was in the audience was pretty frustrated because he's like, okay, so I have to flow this covered data down the supply chain, and people who I flow it to have to have implemented the requirements. How do I validate the people that I flow it to have done the thing that they're supposed to do? And specifically, they said, why is there no repository that I can go check that has the publicly listed company names of everybody who's level 2 certified, right? So the government has like CMMC EMAS where they can see everybody's CMMC status in it. And SPRS has your score that some people can see based off what you've uploaded as self-assessment, or maybe you've had a DIBCAC assessment. But you can't just Google, like on the Cyber AB's website, the list of all the companies that have CMMC level 2 certifications. And in fact, from what we've heard anecdotally, the AB and the DoD are discouraging people from using their level 2 certifications as marketing material, which is frankly probably a non-starter for most people. They're going to be flying that flag.
Oh, they're doing it. We're seeing it every day on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
I'm certified. You know, it's like, good for you.
Yeah.
You deserve that, by the way.
Yeah, it's that is not going to be a thing that people try to avoid. But there isn't a repository of a list of everybody who has their CMMC level 2 certification, and there isn't going to be such a repo. So how do they validate that the companies that they flow the data to have done it? Daniel, I don't know if you have seen anything like this or if you have any ideas, but basically the only thing that you got is taking their word for it, because you can ask for their CMMC, level 2 cert, but you essentially are flowing the language in 7012 to them and saying, do you attest that you have implemented these requirements? And that's all you got. And if that makes you nervous and that makes you feel a little shaky and you don't have a lot of assurance that it's true, welcome to the situation that the DoD has been in for the last 10 years and why they're making CMMC a thing in the first place.
I mean, I've seen this firsthand, and primes are already requesting copies of CMMC certifications to store in their supply chain program system, whatever that might be. They're not obviously distributing it publicly, but they are requesting for copies of it, or they're requesting the CCRA be filled out, which is a template that a bunch of the primes agreed on for cybersecurity risk. They're asking for more and more evidence. But here's the thing: people can falsify things, right?
Sure.
If you've seen a copy of a CMMC certification, it's not exactly hyper complex.
We've all taken the OPSEC training that says don't put pictures of your badge from work online.
Right. And so, but you look at that and you're like, okay, like I could Photoshop and send that up the chain. There is no validating mechanism. And I think if I were a betting man, the reason they don't want to have a central database of this is because both pro and con. Pro, they don't want these people to become a target for some sort of potential exploit, or, hey, they at least know that these things are implemented in the organization, problematic. And then con, also adversaries would know if the company they're targeting is not on that list, they have bad security potentially put in place, right? So I get maybe the logic behind we don't want to circulate that information. Primes will be requesting copies of your CMMC certification, hard stop. And they're going to be contractually flowing it down. I mean, there's just no other way around it.
Yeah, I think that the DoD is never, whether you agree or not, I think the DoD is never going to accept the risk of publicly listing all of the companies that have CMMC level 2 certifications. They're gonna say that it's too risky to have them aggregated in all one spot, in all one location. Although, to be fair, it's like, if you go to the website of the average defense contractor, they have these cyber requirements by virtue of being a defense contractor, and their websites are full of like what we do to put precision parts and lasers on jets and satellites and stuff. So it's not that hard to figure out. But the DoD, from what I've heard them say, I just cannot imagine a world in which they'll say, we're going to publicly list all of the level 2 certified companies, even though you could still get that information. Security through obscurity is not security, but I don't see a world where they would ever create such a repo list of companies. I just don't see it.
Scott, to your point, another thing that could maybe be a proxy to this is, hey, I'm Joe's Machine Shop. Here's a list of my assessor if you want to validate that this actually happened. I'm not just sending you falsified information, right? That's a good play as well if you're a prime. A little bit more overhead to coordinate all of that, but definitely worth it from a due diligence perspective.
It might be cool if they just had, if the cert number or whatever the identifier for your certification is, if they had a system like ISC squared has, where it's like, I could give you my CISSP number and you can go and validate that it's still true and real. That would be nice to have, but there isn't really a simple answer. And until it's a requirement and everybody has a cert, as of right now, you just kind of have to take self-attestation as the only proof. So it's fun to watch people say, how do I know if they've implemented the requirements if there isn't a repo? And you're like, yeah, that's why we're doing this. Still doesn't fix the problem, but it was a pretty interesting question here. All right. Another question that happened at Gold Coast. Basically, the question was, can I get a CMMC Level 3 certification with a CMMC Level 2 conditional status? And the answer is no.
No.
Basically, the way they phrased the question was, okay, well, I can pass CMMC with an 88. Does that mean that I can get a Level 3 with less than a 110? The way that this question was answered at Gold Coast, in my opinion, was a little stumbly, because you can just direct people to 32 CFR 170 in the section that covers CMMC Level 3. And it says that you must have CMMC Level 2 C3 PAO status in order to do it. You cannot have a conditional status in order to get Level 3. So if you have a POAM after your CMMC Level 2 assessment, you got to clear all that up and then talk to DIBCAC for your Level 3. Alrighty, let's see here. This was a question that the presenter at Gold Coast wouldn't answer. And so, Daniel, what is your answer here? What is the time frame for an average contractor, average small business contractor, to go from step zero, all the way to Level 2 CMMC certification?
So if you're going the enclave route, and this is enclave that you would own, right? Like Summit 7 would deploy and manage for you, you're looking at about 6 months that's documentation, implementation, all of that stuff. And then you have the kind of all-in approach, which is making the whole company compliant. That's 12 to 18 months typically to turn that ship. So there's kind of two different things there. Now, you probably are on here and you've probably seen promoted ads for, hey, get compliant in 3 days, right? Hey, we can get you an enclave in a week, right? All of those things can be true, kind of. So, and the reason I say all that is like, just be aware of what you're getting yourselves into. So like a lot of organizations are popping up with hosted enclave solutions. You pay a per seat license for virtual desktop access to their environment. Doesn't negate all the documentation that you have to do, but you inherit a lot of controls, right, from them, which is great. However, and Jacob, we say this a lot, can that single environment process and store and transmit all of the CUI that you need to execute the actual contract? We're seeing a lot of people rush into enclaves because it's an easy, immediate fix to get certified. But in performance of an actual contract, which is what will be the actual requirement, you have to bring all systems into scope that have to process, store, and transmit that. So listen, everybody wants an easy button, completely understand, but make sure that whatever you're doing, you're setting yourself up to not only be certified for the sake of being certified, but using a certified environment that you can actually execute a contract within. Because if you can't, it's all been for naught. The data is not being protected. You would then be in violation of your DFAR 7021 requirement at that point. And we think false claims have ticked up right now because of SPRS scores being outdated or incorrect. Just imagine if somebody's attested that they're putting all their CUI in a CMMC certified environment and they are not. So be very, very, very careful about the easy button. Nothing is ever as good as it seems, ever. Like in the history of the world, if it's too good to be true, guess what? It probably is.
Yeah. Regarding that validation question, Blake says, our company's run a NIST self-assessment campaign for the last 4+ years and now prepping a CMMC campaign. You have to control your own contract partner list, also have a separate bid list. The bid list issue is RFPs containing federal contract information. I believe most are FCI in nature, and some even contain CUI. Then what? Bid companies aren't contractually required to have CMMC yet if the job isn't awarded yet. Yeah, that's a big problem, right? Is if you're going to bid on work for data that is CUI, but you only have to have the cert by the time of award, what do you end up needing? The policy is you need the cert by the time of award. So if you end up getting the data beforehand, that's just a gap in the regulation that the DoD has been willing to accept. So in the 2020 rule and in the actual 2024 rule that went in place at the end of last year, they talk about the timing requirement for CMMC certification. And in their view, there's basically 3 points that they could require a cert for industry before companies can even bid on contracts, before companies take award of a contract, or sometime after they take award of a contract. And their rationale in the rule was if they put it before bidding, it's too hard for industry to deal with. It's too strict of a requirement. If they put it after the contract is awarded, it's too much risk for the department. And so the compromise was you can bid on the work, and that might involve some amount of CUI. They don't know. But you have to have the cert by the time of award in order to actually conduct the work itself. And that was their compromise. So yeah, there are going to be edge cases where it slips through like that, just like the COTS exemption is an edge case, because COTS suppliers might end up getting CUI. But because you're a COTS supplier, you don't have to have the cert. That's just a risk that the department was willing to take, which is great for the COTS suppliers, not so great for the CUI. But this one regulation can't fix all of the gaps. It just fixes most of them. So yeah, there are going to be situations like that. If that CUI is passed around, as part of the bid process, it's weird, but it is technically not covered by the regulation. So
to that point, if you're having somebody review the data that doesn't plan to be CMMC certified at time of contract award, don't take their bid on the work for yourself as a prime. So you have to basically go ahead and say, are you certified? If not, will you be in the next 30 days before I can even want to receive your information to bid this job? Because I couldn't use you even if I wanted to, right? Come time of award. So
yeah, absolutely. All righty, let's see. Alyssa says, what would you consider the longest pole in the tent for the timeline to certification?
Backlog.
Assessment
right now,
assessment or implementation?
Both.
Yeah.
I think right now, if you look at both backlogs between implementers and assessors, implementers are running 2 to 3 months backlog. Assessors on the low end are running 2 to 3 months. That's potentially upwards of 6 months just in waiting, not actually doing anything. So if the doing part takes 3 months, but you have to wait in line 6 months, that's 9 months. That's a long time. So I tell people, and this has been my saying for years, Jacob even made me an awesome LinkedIn banner about it. You can be early to CMMC, you can be late, but you can't be on time. And a large portion of that burden is if you wait to try and be on time, like everybody else seems to be doing, the line and the queue to actually get anything done is going to be astronomical. Hard stop. We are, as far as I'm aware, we are probably the largest implementer of CMMC services in the United States. We have close to 300 people, and we're one of the largest.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? If we look at, let's say 60% of the data generated by the DoD or in receipt of is CTI requiring certification based on the memos. What's 60% of 80,000, Jacob?
Was that 50,000, something like that?
48,000?
It's getting up
I
there.
did the math real quick. Math's hard. And so we're looking at, potentially a very large portion of the supply chain having to be certified very rapidly. And those that have it, you used this quote last week, or you said this last week, which I love. A contracting officer only has to have a bid, right? They don't need 37 bids for a job. If anything, they'd prefer to have fewer bids. That's something that the DoD memo that just came out stated as well. They're like, hey, don't overburden some of the requirements because you won't get a lot of bids. And contracting officers are probably like, I don't want a lot of bids.
I don't need 80,000 bids. I need 7.
I need 7 bids, right? I need 3 bids. I need whatever it is. I'll even go as far as sole sourcing if I need to, right? And so it only takes one company in your industry and the part of their supply chain that's compliant to win a stupid amount of work in the first 12 months.
Yeah.
That's it.
I agree with how Jason frames, his answer to this question. The longest pole in the tent is the time to implement the requirements and the 320 assessment objectives. Yeah. The fact that the longest, I always say that the constraint on assessment is not the main problem that people have. It's the constraint on implementation, because most people haven't implemented the requirements. So everybody goes, there won't be enough assessors. That only matters if there are enough people seeking assessment. And most people aren't ready for an assessment because they haven't implemented the requirements. And so the irony is that the longest pole in the tent for certification is implementing the things that you're trying to get certified. So yeah, I agree with the way that Jason frames it. Alyssa had a follow-up. She said, what's the difference between implementation versus assessment? So implementation, we're talking about actually implementing the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 that are
4
required
to 6
by
months.
yeah, that are required by DFARS clause 252 204 7012. It's not a CMMC thing. That's the existing contract requirement that's existed since 2016. Assessment is once you've implemented those things and you go out and hire a C3 PAO, they come in and validate your implementation to say, yeah, it's true. That gives the DoD assurance that rather than you just self-attesting and saying we pinky promise that we've done it, their external assessors have said, yes, it is true that they have implemented it. Here's a certification that says they're good for the next 3 years. And so a lot of people say, well, there aren't enough assessors. And we say there aren't enough implementers. And because most people haven't implemented it, it doesn't matter if you have enough assessors or not, because currently we have enough assessors for how many people are ready for assessment. You know, we've got several hundred CMMC Level 2 certified companies, and the backlogs for those assessments are sitting around weeks to months, not, you know, years of time, because there just aren't enough people that are going for it and all that stuff. It reminds me when I was talking to that C3 PAO at Gold Coast about that company that failed because their certified MSP wasn't doing the things that they said they were doing. The way that I phrased it was from the C3 PAO's perspective was, we're not a C3 PAO. This is them talking.
No.
They said, we don't want to fail you, but we can't just let you pass, is essentially the way that I thought about it as they were talking to me, because they were like, they want you to pass, they want you to do well, but sometimes it's just so egregious that they just, you know, you can't look the other way. That's what we're talking about with the implementation side.
And yeah, so we are implementers. That's what we do, and you can do it yourself. Absolutely, if you have the staff and the knowledge and the people, like, please, like,
you can implement it and you can validate it, right? That's the thing about 171 and 171A. Is that you've got the requirements and you've got the validation procedures to prove that you've done it to yourself, to your boss, to your insurance company, to the DoD, to whoever you want. The NIST requirements have standardized verification procedures. There's no magic kung fu, like an ISO auditor shows up and they go, today, I think this is how we would prove that this control is implemented, or a SOC 2 auditor that says, today in my head, I woke up and I thought this is a great way to validate this requirement. They've standardized how you validate the requirements. So yeah, you don't have to hire anybody if you've got the time and the money and the expertise. Most people don't. And that's why it's so important to pick the right partner. All righty, let's see here. Garrett says, if you use Exchange in GCC High, do you also need to use OME or other encryption tools like Prevail to send email? How about to someone else in GCC High?
Interesting. I had a debate with Caleb about this about a year ago. So long story short, if you're sending things externally, you will want to encrypt it. Outlook message encryption, OME. You don't need to use bolt-ons in GCC High because it'll encrypt it to FIPS. So you're good on that side. But I was having the conversation with him because GCC High is all sitting within inside Microsoft Gov data center. So it's just going to go from, you know, one server to another, literally sometimes within the same physical data center. And we know that data center is FedRAMP, right? We know it meets those requirements for those controls. Technically, there's a world where I think you can make the case where you wouldn't have to encrypt it, sending it to another GCC High instance, because you know that path based on Microsoft's FedRAMP authorization is compliant. So that's kind of the interesting thing there, right? It leaves your workstation, goes from one Microsoft tenant, you know, in their data center to another server in their data center. And we know that's encrypted because of the FedRAMP inheritance, but that is so hard to like justify or prove. We just tell people, if you're sending CUI externally, encrypt it. Just use the native, you know, Microsoft encryption. Don't have to get fancy. Don't have to use third parties like Prevail or Kiteworks or things like that from an email transmission perspective.
Gotcha.
But just encrypt it.
All right, Megan's here. Love seeing Megan every week. She says, for requirement 3.1.20, verify and control or limit connections to and use of external systems. If we are in an enclave using Azure M365 GCC High, is AvePoint for backing up M365 data considered an external system?
See, I've seen people go either way on this. I honestly wouldn't consider it an external system, right? It's a known connection that you're allowing, and it's a CUI asset that's technically part of your boundary. I zoom out from this and say, your boundary are things not included in scope from an external perspective. So, right. So like what's on the other side of the door, right? That would be external. But everything that I'm connecting to, if it's in my SSP and I'm deeming it as an asset, especially for processing or transmitting CUI, I would not consider that an external connection.
Yeah. Paraphrasing the NIST 853 and RMF guidance that's been around for years and years, the rule of thumb for external versus internal system is, do you control that system or not? Right? Is like, do I make decisions over the control of that system, or does somebody else? If somebody else controls that system, it's external to me. It's outside of my boundary. Obviously, there's specific scoping considerations for boundaries for CMMC, but that's the general rule of thumb. So if you control it, it's not external. If you do, or if you don't control it, somebody else has control over decisions around that system, that would be considered in general an external system.
That's why it's kind of hard, because in SaaS world, which is what AvePoint is, you control your instance of it to some extent, but you don't have ultimate control over that, right? Now you're inheriting the FedRAMP piece. So like there obviously is a little bit of a dance there. So yeah, I've seen it play out both ways is basically what I'm trying to say.
And it's back to that point of like, you can use some of this language to draw scoping lines in the ways that you want to, if you're willing to exploit the language and the loopholes in that guidance, right? Like if you're looking for an absolute black and white answer, they're kind of few and far between. That's a good thing and a bad thing. If you want absolute black and white answers, you're kind of not going to get them. But if you leverage the gray areas in the guidance, then you can scope your environments to your advantage for cost, assessment risk, things like that. We talk about Ryan Bonner on here all the time. That's basically what his firm does, is using the gray space and guidance around CUI, scoping, all that other stuff to hyper aggressively keep scope as small as possible in order to save money.
Also, John Cronick, AvePoint is an app within the Enclave. We use it and got certified with it in place.
Nice. Nice. All right. Jonathan says, regarding the 32 CFR 170 requirement on CMMC level 2 artifact retention period of 2 certification cycles, 6 years, does this retention period apply to all CMMC level 2 related materials, such as encryption keys or expired certificates? So the language in 32 CFR 170 for artifact retention is the artifacts used as evidence for the assessment must be retained by the organization for 6 years from the CMMC status date. So whatever artifacts were used to prove the assessment objectives in 171A, that's what you have to keep for 6 years. If it wasn't used,
go ahead. Sorry.
If it wasn't used as evidence, then that's not what the policy says. So keep track of what was used as evidence in the assessment, and that's what you have to retain.
And so to give you an example, Jonathan, like when you're doing this, you're probably providing a screenshot of a certificate. You're not actually providing a copy of the certificate in a lot of ways, right? For like an SSL certificate. The screenshot would be the artifact that proves that, yes, you had this thing. And that would be deemed an artifact as the assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel says, one of the organizationally defined parameters for 171 Rev 3 reads, external service providers must meet SB 800 171 revision 2. That is true. Yeah, it does say that. Do you expect this to be changed to Rev 3 at some point? Yes, I do. So that current ODP definitions are not enforceable. 171 Rev 3 is not the current requirement. The language in DFAR 7012 says implement the most current version of the NIST requirements at the time of the solicitation. But about 15 months ago, in May of last year, the DoD issued a class deviation for DFAR 7012. And they said, instead of using the language in 7012, use this language instead. And it says, rather than use whatever the most current version is, use 171 Rev 2. We won't see 171 Rev 3 be the requirement until after CMMC 3.0, if you will, rulemaking is done, at which point they are probably going to include the ODPs in the text of 32 CFR 170, and it will say 171 Rev 3. You can see an example of this if you look in 32 CFR 170 right now. CMMC Level 3 requirements have their ODPs defined. 171 R2 does not. And so the future version of 32 CFR 170 will have ODPs for both 171 Rev 3 and 172. And that's probably how that'll play out. Yeah, it's a typo. It's pretty hilarious, but yeah, it's typo. They'll fix it. Let's see here. Let's see. Alyssa's here. Okay. She says, y'all are implementer helpers. And when you say you go in and implement CMMC, you mean on behalf of your customers? Yes. Yeah. For the most part, depending on the degree to which people want us to do the work for them. We do everything from sell you the licensing and give you the keys to the car, and then you're good to go, all the way up to we pick you up from your house and we drive the limo wherever you want to go around town, like whatever degree of support.
It's a great analogy, by the way.
Yeah, like we can give you the keys to the car and then you go find it. We can build you the car and then give you the keys. We can build you the car and drive it for you if you want us to. Just depends on to what degree you want us to give you access to the right environment, implement within that environment, implement and run the environment for you, augment your existing staff, everything in between. We've got all different kinds of use cases there. Let's see here. Jason says, time for boots on the ground for a C3PAO level 2 certification assessment should not take longer than 5 to 8 business days, assuming the evidence is adequate and sufficient and proper. Yeah, the actual assessment itself doesn't take very much time. And we've heard this where some of these level 2 certification assessments don't even take the full 5 days. They really rip through them, especially in situations where people are using, well-known MSP partners who've gone through dozens and dozens of assessments, and people are very familiar with their architecture. They're very familiar with what's going on. The MSPs have people on staff who are very good at going through assessments. They're assessor trained themselves, and they can just rip through and be like, here's what you need, here's what you need, here's what you need, which is, we hit a milestone a couple weeks ago where we had 4 clients go through an assessment concurrently in the same 5-day period because we just had the ability to support that level. So the actual assessment itself doesn't take very much time. You're right. Okay. Nicholas says, if all CUI is stored in an on-site server with full disk encryption and each workstation is encrypted with BitLocker, does the Wi-Fi also need to be encrypted?
Very interesting. Okay, 2 pieces of information. Data at rest being encrypted on both sides, that's great. However, you have to solve the data in transit problem being encrypted if you want to leave your network out of scope, right? So just because I'm moving from one encrypted location to another, very likely the transmission of that is going to fall under an unencrypted connection, right? Unless I intentionally are encrypting the file level, not just the disk itself. And so if assuming that the data itself is not encrypted, the individual pieces of data, not the actual storage location, then yes, your network would need to be brought in scope for compliance. Now, to counterbalance that, you can do physical compensating controls. You can do encryption. So you can enable FIPS on that. Wireless, especially if it's, Jacob, we've had a conversation in the past about, your wireless radius and, encryption keys and things like that. That's the most common way to do it, is just to enable FIPS.A cryptography and apply WPA, 2, 3, et cetera, encryption to that as well. But yeah, it all kind of depends, right? You've got to either just kind of go back to the first level here. You've got to either protect it with encryption, FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography, or physical compensating controls. So be prepared to answer either of those questions in kind of that scoping scenario.
Yeah. Have y'all run into any folks looking for level 3 so far? Yes, we have.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say a ton of people looking for level 3, but there is interest in level 3. After that Golden Dome memo started making the rounds earlier this week. So our great and powerful CEO, Scott Edwards, said that 4 hours after these emails and messages started flying around with this memo, somebody called him and was like, when can we get started on level 3? Yep. We haven't heard when DoD will be ready for their DIBCAC assessors to run level 3 assessments, but the memo, as we talked about on the podcast, says that level 3 will be a big part of Golden Dome contracts and work for suppliers. So yes, we have had some people interested in it. And we have accelerated our timeline for our level 3 offerings as a result. Even if DoD says that they're still a little ways away, pretty common for, especially the early adopters that we work with. A lot of those folks are doing some pretty high speed stuff, and so they anticipate that they will need level 3. Also, it's been pretty reliable over the last couple of years, where if you had a DibCAC high assessment, that you are eventually going to need level 3, and we have quite a few of those clients. So yeah, we've had some people interested in it for sure. We're ready.
We're also in line, if you will. Yeah. We've already tried to put our hat in the ring for DibCAC to say, hey, whenever you open up the list, put our name on it. So we're ready to get certified to L3 too.
Yeah, there's a reason why we have a 24/7 SOC staffed only by U.S. citizens, is to get ready for CMMC level. It's one, it's a good thing to have, but two, it's a requirement for level 3. So there you go. Okay. Michael says, I understand that CISA's Scuba utility is a great tool for evaluating security configurations of M365 tenant, but is it required that every one of these tests be a pass in order to satisfy CMMC controls, or are some considered optional? I personally haven't looked at the comparison between Scuba and 800.171 requirements in quite a while. My understanding is they are not one for one. And so if you run the Scuba utility and you get a pass on everything, that does not mean that you are meeting all the requirements for 800.171. Very frustrating, because this is part of this turf war between CISA and DoD and the other federal agencies, and they can't just freaking get along for the benefit of everybody else. So as far as I know, Scuba is great, but take it with a grain of salt, because I believe that it does not have full coverage, but we'll have to double check and get back to you.
It doesn't. We've looked at it before. I don't think we did a full crosswalk of it back to our config. But yeah, I mean, it's a good starter tool, but you have to crosswalk it all back to 171 at the end of the day. I know there's holes in it. I just can't remember what they were.
Let's see here. Alyssa, no need to apologize if you have questions, Alyssa. That's literally what we're here for. Ask all the questions you got. If we don't get to them, then we'll just, push them off into the backlog for next week. So here's an interesting one. You want to take this one, Daniel?
I do. So transit, you can either have file level encryption, or you can have the transit mechanism itself encrypted. So what makes work from home actually work by leaving your home network out of scope is the transmission, the tunnel of which the data is traveling through, is encrypted, in this case, TLS 1.2, 1.3, right? So again, FIPS validated cryptography is being leveraged in that TLS connection over the internet. So that data from my endpoint that has encryption turned on to the cloud example, right, is encrypted both at rest on my workstation, in transit over TLS, and then at rest back on the other end of that cloud provider like GCC Hive.
Gotcha. All righty, everybody. Well, that's an hour already. It flies by every time we do this. We do this every Friday. You can go to CUIHotline.org and fill out the form. We have some form questions in the backlog that we're going to get to next week. You can call the number and leave your question with your beautiful voices if you want to. If you find this on LinkedIn or YouTube, feel free to leave your questions in the comments on those streams. You can DM us the questions. Be sure to check out our website. Some people were talking about the new knowledge base that we've got up there. So summit7.us, under resources, you go to knowledge base, where we're sort of capturing all of these frequently asked questions together. And so you can always check that out anytime. Let's see. Next week is our Secure the Dib virtual event. It's a half day. It's free. We're talking about some really cool and interesting stuff, like what our SOC analysts have seen. Daniel, you're talking about why enclaves aren't necessarily the magic easy button that people make them out to be, even though we would love that because we sell them.
Sure.
It would be awesome if we could just say, you just sign right here and you're good to go. But we can't say that. So you're going to be explaining why. Scott's going to be up there talking about cost considerations, all the sort of big buckets of questions that people ask. It's free. It's half day. You should check it out. It looks awesome. We were on the set last week, giving everybody a sneak preview, so it's going to be super fun. And we'll see you next week.
See y'all.